We learned new things. That's what one member of the House Intelligence Committee said today after Michael Cohen's second closed session in a week testifying to that committee. That member of the committee also said that Michael Cohen brought new documents to the committee today. The chairman of the committee, Adam Schiff, said it was a, quote, enormously productive session. One of the things the House investigative committees are trying to learn is whether President Trump or his lawyers tried to use the possibility of a presidential pardon to prevent Michael Cohen and others from testifying against Donald Trump. In a breaking news report tonight, the New York Times is reporting that the president's TV lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, says that lawyers for several people approached him about the possibility of presidential pardons. The Times reports Mr. Giuliani, who has been representing Mr. Trump since last spring, said he always insisted to defense lawyers that Mr. Trump would not consider granting pardons until the investigations were long over. I always gave one answer, and they always left disappointed, Mr. Giuliani said. The Times notes tonight that President Trump's first legal team, headed by Washington lawyer John Dowd, quote, had discussions with lawyers for Paul Manafort and Michael T. Flynn in 2017 about pardons. ABC News is reporting that in the weeks following the raid on Michael Cohen's home, office, and hotel room last year, Michael Cohen was, quote, contacted by two New York attorneys who claimed to be in close contact with Rudy Giuliani. Sources described the lawyer's contact with Cohen as an effort to keep him in the tent. NBC News has confirmed that, according to a source familiar with the matter, Michael Cohen provided the Intelligence Committee today with new documents showing edits to the written statement that he delivered to Congress in 2017 about a project to build a Moscow Trump Tower. Here's what Michael Cohen said about those edits in last week's public hearing.
Mr. Trump's personal lawyers reviewed and edited my statement to Congress about the timing of the Moscow Tower negotiations before I gave it. So to be clear, Mr. Trump knew of and directed the Trump-Moscow negotiations throughout the campaign and lied about it. He lied about it because he never expected to win. He also lied about it because he stood to make hundreds of millions of dollars on the Moscow real estate project. And so I lied about it too, because Mr. Trump had made clear to me through his personal statements to me that we both knew to be false, and through his lies to the country that he wanted me to lie. And he made it clear to me because his personal attorneys reviewed my statement before I gave it to Congress.
Michael Cohen has pleaded guilty to lying to Congress in that written statement that he now says was edited by Donald Trump's lawyers. Trump attorney Jay Sekulow denied the allegation by Michael Cohen that Trump lawyers suborned the perjury to Congress that Michael Cohen has now confessed to and pleaded guilty to. Here's what Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff said about Michael Cohen's new testimony today.
He answered every question that was put to him by members of both parties. He was fully cooperative with the committee. We had requested documents of Mr. Cohen. He has provided additional documents to the committee. There may be additional documents that he still has to offer, and his cooperation with our committee continues. So I think the members found it an enormously productive session.
Some of the additional documents that Michael Cohen submitted to the committee today no doubt include copies of checks to Michael Cohen that were published in the New York Times today. In last week's hearing, Michael Cohen revealed some checks that he said were part of Donald Trump's reimbursement to him for the $130,000 that Michael Cohen illegally paid to Stormy Daniels during the presidential campaign, a crime that Michael Cohen says he committed at the direction of then presidential candidate Donald Trump. We now have 8 of the checks that were part of that reimbursement scheme. The first 2 of these checks are from the Donald Trump Trust account, an account that was established when Donald Trump became president, and a trust was established by the Trump company that was supposed to isolate the Trump business from Donald Trump himself during the presidency. Those first 2 checks from the trust are signed by the company's chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg, and Donald Trump Jr. The next check in the sequence should be an April check, which we have not yet seen. And the check after that is a May 23rd check that is the first one in the sequence that comes from a different checking account. It appears to be a personal checking account of Donald J. Trump, and it is signed by Donald Trump. Why the change in checks? Why the different checks from a different checking account suddenly on May 23rd, 2017? Why did the Trump business decide they no longer should be involved in the payments to Michael Cohen? Robert Mueller was appointed special prosecutor on May 17th, 2017. And it is the very next check after that, 6 days later, the May 23rd check that suddenly comes from a different checking account and is signed by Donald Trump personally. And all of the checks reimbursing Michael Cohen for the rest of the year come from that different checking account now that Donald Trump and everyone at the Trump business knows that there is a special prosecutor investigating Donald Trump and the Trump organization. And all of the rest of those payoff checks to Michael Cohen come from that Donald Trump checking account with only one signature on those checks, only the signature of Donald Trump. Was Alan Weisselberg no longer willing to sign those checks? Why did Alan Weisselberg stop signing those reimbursement checks to Michael Cohen after Robert Mueller was appointed special prosecutor? Surely someone in the House Intelligence Committee today, behind closed doors, asked Michael Cohen that question. Here's what Michael Cohen had to say after that closed-door hearing today.
The hearings went very, very well. I believe that all of the members were satisfied with the statements and the responses that I gave to them. I told them that any additional information that they would want, they should feel comfortable to reach out to my counsel, and I would continue to cooperate to the fullest extent of my capabilities.
Joining us now, a friend of Michael Cohen, Donny Deutsch, MSNBC contributor. He texted with Michael Cohen before, during, and after his congressional testimony today. So he has the latest for us. And Tim O'Brien, executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion and an MSNBC contributor. He's been reporting on Donald Trump literally for decades. He wrote a book about Donald Trump that got him sued by Donald Trump, and Tim O'Brien won that lawsuit. Donny, the checks, seeing this change, where you go from the two signatures of Alan Weisselberg and Donald Trump Jr., and suddenly no one's willing to sign these checks anymore after a special prosecutor is announced, and we see one signature on the checks, Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think you laid it out perfectly. And I think what's interesting is that Weisselberg, and we talked last time Tim and I were on how he's going to be such a key figure, he was the guy doing everything. So it's fascinating that all of a sudden Trump is signing his own checks. And one other thing about Trump and checks, Trump does not like to pay money. People know who've worked for Trump in New York over the years. It's very hard to collect for anything. Here now, all of a sudden, Donald Trump, amidst his daily presidential routines, is writing retainer checks to a guy who he says barely, even when he was working for him, was his lawyer. Now he hasn't worked for him technically in months, just doing some advice, and all of a sudden urgently writing him checks on a very, very timely basis. Very un-Trump-like.
And Tim, there hasn't really been a defense offered for these checks, but what they've tried to sort of pump out there through some of the Republican members of the committee who were public asking questions is that there was a retainer agreement for this lawyer. Michael Cohen is indeed a lawyer, but you have all these public statements from Donald Trump himself saying that, oh, Michael Cohen didn't do anything for me. He was just this guy I let hang around. He didn't really do anything. So as usual, on the record, we have Trump's statements that contradict a sort of Trump theory of defense. But the other issue is if you're a lawyer in a retainer agreement, those things are written. I've seen retainer agreements for lawyers, and they're pretty simple. Yeah. There's got to be a retainer agreement that you produce, or there isn't. And if Alan Weisselberg can't produce that retainer agreement, I don't know how he justifies signing these checks.
Well, then we'd be shocked again to discover that members of the Trump trio are lying about what's occurred here. You know, it's interesting that irrevocable trust is in play right here, because they set that up after Trump became president, and it was essentially this fig leaf that was established to give the appearance that the Trump family was insulating the Trump family businesses from the White House, because the president came into the White House as the most financially conflicted president of the modern era. Every president prior to him had released their tax returns, and if they had business holdings, they either put them into an authentically blind trust or sold them. Trump didn't do any of the above. And that irrevocable trust is run by Alan Weisselberg, the CFO, and his two eldest sons. The fact that those checks were being cut out of the trust presumes that the boys and Alan knew what the money was being spent on. So they now are part of a possible criminal conspiracy involving the payment of hush money and campaign finance law violations. I imagine that at some point they dawned on them. This is also not a particularly bright group of people. Probably, apparently, after the second or third check got cut, they thought, uh-oh, we've been pulled into this. And they tell the president it has to come from elsewhere. And Trump says, okay, I'll use my personal checking account. Now, he has also said that he wasn't really sure where any of these funds were going or what they were being used for. And it reminded me, you know, in the mid-1980s, Spy Magazine did this great spoof where they mailed checks to different New York potentates. Yes. The first was for $15. 50 people, including Donald Trump, cashed it. Then for $5, 4 people and Donald Trump. And then for 50 cents. And I think Trump was the only one who cashed the final check.
Yeah.
This is a guy who knows where every dollar is going.
And Donnie, one thing Lindsey Graham said in his, defense of Donald Trump here is, well, people don't commit crimes with checks. What Lindsey Graham is suggesting in that is that Donald Trump, as president of the United States, could somehow get $35,000 over the course of the year, hundreds of thousands of dollars out of a bank somehow in cash, and deliver these massive piles of cash to Michael Cohen, with all of those cash transactions being illegal.
Yeah.
All of them. Yeah. Like, Lindsey Graham's defense is, why didn't he commit the crime in an even bulkier way that would actually create even more problems for him?
We're not going to try and find logic in Lindsey Graham, otherwise that would be a 4-hour special. But I want to go back to Weisselberg. That's interesting, and I want to draw a line to Bernie Madoff. Not that Trump is running a Ponzi scheme, but Bernie Madoff had a $50 billion fund. And there was one accountant in a little strip mall somewhere you couldn't, because when you are doing nefarious stuff, you can't have a lot of people involved.
Right.
So what is going to be funny, not funny, what's going to be sad and tragic as we unpeel this, and even in this first instance, we're going to see.
And funny.
And, well, sad.
The audience will decide.
You will decide.
Okay?
It will certainly be interesting that you're going to see everything. Just went through this little green visor guy where this supposedly huge corporation, there's no finance department, there's no controllers, there's no budget directors. When you are running either a Ponzi scheme or a dishonest criminal organization, it's got to be very, very isolated. And this was very isolated, and you're starting to see it here.
Let me get you, Donnie, to the pardons, because you would know more about this than anyone who can talk to us. Is these stories that we're getting tonight, saying that lawyers saying we're close to Rudy Giuliani, are approaching Michael Cohen shortly after the raid, and they're talking to him about possibilities of staying in the tent, this kind of code language. What do we know about that?
Well, I'm not at liberty to talk about that, but I will talk about Trump as an autocrat. And if you're an autocrat and you also operate above the law, what is the most autocratic tool a president has? It's a pardon.
Yeah.
So you don't think, knowing the way you more than anybody, understanding Donald Trump, understanding his constant need and ability to knock down obstacles, that in some way, shape, or form, in a mafioso way, not in a direct way, that there wouldn't be overtures out there. It wouldn't make sense if they weren't. So I'm not at liberty to talk about whether pardons were offered or not offered. I do know, though, that common sense tells you that if you're Donald Trump and you know that Michael Cohen knows where all the bodies are buried, at some point he would have wanted to at least keep him under the tent until it was no longer an option.
One more thing about the testimony behind closed doors by Michael Cohen. Do you know if in the closed door testimony, Michael Cohen is in effect allowed by the Southern District prosecutors and by Robert Mueller to say more than in the public testimony?
No, he is really bound in terms of in these things. And look, he's being very careful. That's why I find it laughable when people were suggesting that he was lying the other day when they were editing this thing. Yes, this guy that if he tells the truth gets nothing. If he lies, he gets more jail time. He's going to, in front of the entire world, say, oh, this is a good one. The lawyers edited my statement. Yeah, I think I'm going to just say that on my own, and that's not going to be truthful. So it's preposterous to think that's a lie. Michael's being very careful when it comes to any investigation. The Southern District, Mueller, or anything else is going on. Closed doors, open doors. His line is there are certain places you can't go.
And Tim, Alan Weisselberg, it just keeps coming down to Alan Weisselberg. He's going to be asked at some point, probably publicly in these hearings, was there a retainer agreement? Can you show us the retainer agreement, a piece of paper? Or he's just going to say, no, there wasn't. Michael Cohen's telling the truth. This was our reimbursement method for him. I mean, he doesn't have a lot of range of possibility here.
Well, that's also probably the least of his worries in terms of the questions he's going to get, because he's been there for decades. They're going to ask him about Trump's tax returns. They're going to ask him about possible money laundering. They're going to ask him about whether or not they committed insurance fraud, which is why I suspect before Alan Weisselberg even lands in Congress, he's going to get an immunity deal in order to sit there and talk, because his knowledge is so vast and expansive that I don't know how he could go in there and not incriminate himself, because he's been tied to the hip with Trump for decades on this stuff.
You know, if there weren't more heavier crimes involved in this, the first thing any accountant would point to in this switch of checks is a business is paying a business expense to Michael Cohen and deducting it from their taxes, and that business suddenly decides it's not a business expense, and it's then paid by an individual. That means the business payments were illegal, but that is the tiniest of the possible illegalities in this whole scheme.
Boris, as we talked later, this is all very tiny. This is all scratching the surface, my friend.
And your point is, there is a mountain. And Michael Cohen is now just playing around with the tip of the iceberg publicly.
Yeah.
We see how Trump flaunts the law publicly. Imagine at the head of a private company what he was doing in the real estate business, which is so slippery to begin with. Any type of fraud, stealing, cheating, whether it be insurance, whether it be bank, whether it be taxes, whether it be philanthropic. That's what this guy does.
Donny Deutsch, the guide to the workings of Trump world, and Tim O'Brien, who's literally written the book about it. Thank you both very much for joining us. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.